Like everyone else, I was honored to accept the invitation to appear here. The first thing you think about is, well, what shall I talk about? And the first advice that writers and speakers get is write about what you know. And I've been writing about income inequality for more than 30 years. And I know that income inequality has always been a very important issue in Mexico, so it seemed like the right topic. The question I'll pose is the fact that income inequality has been rising sharply. In the US, virtually all the income gains in the last 4 decades have gone to people at the very top of the income ladder, but the pattern's similar in other countries as well. Is that a problem, and is there anything we could or should try to do about it? We haven't made much progress in the debate on this question because mainly we've talked about these issues in terms of fairness and justice. It's very easy for reasonable people to disagree about concepts like that. Fairness and justice are hard concepts. I propose to shift the terms of the debate and discuss the consequences, the practical consequences of rising income inequality. And I think I've got what most of you will regard as a surprising conclusion, a man bites dog conclusion. I'm going to argue, based on very simple premises, that the rich and the poor suffer when income inequality rises. I think everybody believes that the poor suffer because of it. I'm going to try to persuade you, based on some very simple propositions, that I don't think anyone, liberal or conservative, would have any trouble accepting. The fans of Richard Dawkins will accept these principles. The fans of Deepak Chopra will as well. If I say something you don't agree with, I hope you'll send me a note telling me what it was. The linchpin of the argument is how context affects evaluation. David Konzovic talked about this in his presentation earlier today. Let me start with a question: which of these two vertical lines is longer? You're all smart. Alain de Botton pointed out that you're all smart. I believe that too. If you're smart, you figure it's got to be a trick, and so you say they're the same. They are indeed the same. I made the one on the right by copying the one on the left. But let me ask you this: do you think they really look the same? If you do, then you should schedule an appointment with your neurologist. They should not look the same to you if you have a normal human brain. The one on the right should look longer because it sits in a different context. Economists have been very slow to recognize the importance of context in evaluation, and that's really the crux of the argument I'm going to make. It affects the things we buy and own. A question like this: is my house okay? I lived in a house like that for 2 years when I was a Peace Corps volunteer in rural Nepal. It had 2 rooms, no plumbing, no electricity. Is that house okay? If I lived in that house in Ithaca, New York, my children would be ashamed. They wouldn't want their friends to know where we lived. I would feel ashamed. I never for a moment felt that way about that house in Ithaca, New York, in Nepal. It was a perfectly satisfactory house in every way. I was proud to invite friends over. There's my house now in Ithaca, New York. It's a house that if my friends from Nepal would see it, they would think I had taken complete leave of my senses. What would anybody need such a grand house? They would wonder, why so many bathrooms? Is there a problem? Most people in Ithaca don't think that. Many of my colleagues have houses much bigger than mine. Context is local. Every place and every region has its own standard, and the houses that people with much more money than I have are very different from my house. All the income gains have gone to the top of the pyramid. What have those people been doing? They've been spending more money than before. They build bigger houses. That's not a moral failing. That's what the poor do when they get more money. The middle class does that too. The middle class doesn't seem resentful of the fact that the rich have been building bigger mansions. They want to see pictures. They think they'll be rich someday, or maybe their children will. But there's a group just below the rich. They travel in the same social circles as the rich, and their frame of reference shifts. Maybe now they need to have their daughter's wedding reception at home rather than in a hotel. They build bigger. The people just below them, in turn, build bigger, and it cascades all the way down the income ladder. It's a process I call expenditure cascades. Without referring to that process, there's just no way to explain why the median new house built in the United States in 2007 was 50% bigger than its counterpart from 1970. The median earner didn't have a higher wage in the later year. People have no more money than before. Why are they buying such bigger houses? Because others like them are buying bigger houses. And If they didn't buy them, there would be a consequence. In every country, the better schools are those that serve the more expensive neighborhoods. So if you're the median earner and you fail to spend as much as people like you do on housing, then it's your children that will go to the inferior schools. And that's a very bitter pill for a parent to swallow. And so the middle class has borrowed more, saved less, worked every margin in order to try and make ends meet. How do they do it? What we know is that inequality is a part of this. Some students and I examined large counties in which income inequality grew very rapidly in some, not so rapidly in others. In the counties where inequality grew the most, we saw the biggest increases in symptoms of financial distress. Divorce rates grew at a more rapid rate in those counties. That's a symptom of financial distress, according to Marriage Council. Long commutes, you move further from the center when you're having financial difficulty. Those long commutes increased more in the counties that had greater increases in inequality. There were a greater number of bankruptcies filed in those counties as well. Here's a simple index I constructed in half an hour. I call it the toil index. You start working on the first of the month. How many hours do you have to work before you've earned enough money to pay for the median house in your area? That's what you've got to do to send your children to a school of just average quality. In the 50s, all the way through 1970, that index was very stable. Income inequality was not rising then. Once income inequality started rising in 1970, the index rose sharply in tandem. It was at 42 hours throughout those early decades. It's now up to almost 100 hours. The first 100 hours the median earner works each month is what he must devote to getting access to a school of just average quality. The average American wedding now costs almost 3 times as much as it did 30 years ago. Why has it gotten so much more expensive? Here too we see an expenditure cascade. Does anyone think that the people getting married now are happier because they're spending 3 times as much on their weddings? It's an absurd thought. They're spending more because others like them are spending more and they want to have a special occasion, but a special occasion is just inescapably a relative concept. When everybody spends more, it's like when everybody stands to get a better view, no one sees better than before. These are dollars that are essentially being flushed down the toilet. What could we do about this? It's actually very simple to change people's incentives about how they spend money. We spend more on houses thinking we'll be better off. Everyone else spends more. We just raise the bar that defines adequate, and the same for other celebrations. What if we were to scrap the current income tax entirely and replace it with a much more steeply progressive tax on total consumption expenditure? You would report your income to the IRS, the tax authorities, just as you do now. In addition, you would report how much you had saved during the year. Families do that already for tax-exempt retirement accounts. The difference between those two numbers, your income minus your savings, that's how much you spent during the year. And that amount minus a big standard deduction for the Jones family here, I've indicated a standard deduction of $30,000. That would be subtracted too from your income, and then you pay tax on what's left. And the tax rate starts out low, but then it starts rising gradually, and it can rise much, much higher than we can allow the tax rate to rise under the income tax, because when the income tax rate gets too high, we choke off savings and investment. That's not a worry with a progressive consumption tax. The higher the rate on the highest dollars spent, the more the incentive to save and invest. Think about 2 economies, 2 separate worlds. One has a progressive consumption tax, the other has the same tax structure we have now. In the second society, the rich, lightly taxed as they are, can afford to buy the very best car on offer, which I'll just say for the sake of discussion is the Ferrari F12 Berlinetta. It costs about $1/3 They're happy with that car. It's a wonderful car. In the society where people were paying a steeply progressive consumption tax, they would scale back. They would perhaps buy the Porsche 911 Turbo, which costs only $150,000 pre-tax, but with a 100% tax rate on the last dollar you spend, that would be a $300,000 car there. And here's the magical part of the tax. Once you've seen everybody scale back, everybody spend a little bit less, the capacity of a car to deliver satisfaction at the margin is all about context. the people in the society with the progressive consumption tax would be just as happy with their Porsche 911s as the people in today's society are with their Ferrari F12s. There's another dimension. If we had a progressive consumption tax, we'd raise more revenue. Who's happier? Here's a thought experiment. Somebody who drives a Ferrari for $300,000, and a lightly taxed person in today's society, and drives it on poorly maintained roads, roads with foot-deep potholes frequently, or somebody who's more heavily taxed and has an incentive to spend less on the car, but still has a very, very good car and drives it on well-maintained roads in the society with a progressive consumption tax. That, to my eye, is an easy call. The evidence that we have on the determinants of people's evaluations of things come clearly on the side of the driver in the second society being more satisfied with his situation. So that's the argument. It has very few moving parts. They're simple. They're easy to remember. I don't think any one of them is in the least bit controversial in the light of evidence and the logic that follows from the assumption is that not only would the poor be better off if we had less uneven distribution of consumption in society, the rich would be better off too. Right now, the impoverished middle class cannot afford to pay taxes, and so the starved government can't maintain the infrastructure. People drive on terrible roads, the bridges collapse, the schools aren't maintained. If we had revenue, we could have a much better public sphere, and the sacrifice in the private sphere would be essentially painless, because beyond a certain point, it's all relative. Should we do this? Will we do this? It's very difficult to predict when an idea like this will take root. But if you disagree with the idea, which premise do you challenge? That context matters, that there's been higher incomes concentrated at the top, that there's been an expenditure cascade? None of those things is controversial. This change will happen. There will be $2 trillion a year, according to my rough calculation, in the US that we will save by making this change. That's a sum of money that can alleviate huge amounts of human suffering. Why should we not do this? If you work against this policy, you will look back someday after it's been adopted and have good reason to feel ashamed of yourself trying to protect the current regime. This is a situation where everyone can win. There's no reason not to take this step. So I hope you'll think about it. It's a dangerous idea only if you have a wrong-headed notion about what makes you happy if you have a lot of resources. Being happy, you can have lower expenditure on a lot of the things you buy and still have something that's very, very good and just as satisfying. And the better public sphere supporting that consumption makes a much, much better package overall. Thank you so much for your kind attention. It's been a pleasure to have a chance to speak with you.
Robert, 1 second, please. No. You know each other, no?
We do.
Nos estamos dando cuenta que después de la plática del maestro Frank, bueno, desde Cutter como observador tenemos pues muchas diferencias con sus opiniones. Le pregunté a Robert Cutter, que es, les pido un aplauso para él, profesor de la Universidad de Berkeley, doctor de Economía de Harvard, doctor de Derecho de Berkeley. Entonces, todos discutiendo, we were discussing some of your points that we don't agree very much. And I asked Bob Cutter, hey, why you don't please, we're trying to open the people to different opinions and different perspectives. And I asked him, would you like to make him 2 questions? And because we are not like feeling very comfortable, we don't share all the ideas. Probably none of us is or Chopra, I'm more Dawkins, but I mean, I thought probably we could have some debate here. Please, Bob.
Thank you. Well, Bob and I are old friends, but we usually carry on our discussions and disagreement in relative private. So this is a new setting for me. I want to ask Bob this question. When my son was in the 4th grade, we moved to the University of Chicago for the year. And my son, yes, okay, my son was an avid soccer player. He loved soccer. And when we got to the University of Chicago, the parents who had organized the local soccer league felt that the teams should play, but they should never keep score. And they should never keep score because people would feel bad who lost. And my son hated it because he liked to compete. When he first started in soccer and I was his coach, I told him, it's easy to win, but at the end of this year, you're going to have to know how to lose. And you're going to have to know what you do when you lose to do better next time and why that makes you feel better. And I think that relative competition, not absolute competition, but relative competition is the source of much of our best efforts and our greatest creativity. For example, alas, I shall never get the Nobel Prize. I feel bad about that, but at least I'm trying.
I'm interested, Bob, that you think I would have disagreed with a single word that you said. I agree completely with all of that. I think our challenge, if you look at the people who organize competitions, and I love competitions, I'm a competitive tennis player, I relish
He's beaten me several times.
I relish the fight as much as the next person, but if you look at auto racing associations, they put limits on engine displacement. You can't have a 15-liter engine, it can be a 1.6-liter engine. That makes sense because otherwise everybody would have to put more. We make your children start kindergarten if they turn 6 by December of that year. If they left it up to you, you would say, well, if I hold my kindergartner back a year, he'll be bigger, stronger, smarter, he'll do better in school and be more successful in life from then on. But then other parents would hold their kindergartners back and we'd get 9-year-old kindergartners, 10-year-old kindergartners. We don't let parents make that choice. We say, if your child turns 6 by December, he must start this year. So yes, let there be competition, but don't let the contestants in the competition waste enormous resources on mutually offsetting actions that don't yield any good.
Well, one of the greatest agricultural miracles in the 20th century was developing the new species of wheat. And it turned out that wheat put much of its energy into each stalk trying to grow higher than the one next to it to get more light. And it turns out that if you could breed wheat, so that it put its energy into growing larger grains instead of growing higher, then you got a bigger crop. And I would never want to deny that. I think that it's true there are forms of competition that are destructive, but it does seem to me that the arguments that people would be happier if we compressed inequality, if we created a system in which you did not have so much earned success. I think one of the keys to happiness is earned success. You should succeed and you should feel that you earned your success. And I think that's, that competitive atmosphere involves competition of people with each other that you haven't discussed.
I absolutely believe that same thing. And if you think about the people in the current debate, they say, oh, if the tax rate on the top earners goes up a few percent, people will start withdrawing effort and so on. That's a vision that's totally out of keeping with what we know about people. A big corporation has 40 vice presidents. They all want to be the president. They're competing like mad to be the president. Whether their tax rate at the margin is 35% or 38% or 42%, that's almost totally irrelevant in terms of the outcome of the competition they really care about, which is to have a high position. And there will always be 10% of the people in the top 10%, no matter what rule we pass. And if relative success is what people strive for and makes them happy, we can't take that away. We can make it less costly to conduct the competition.
Well, I went to China in 1994, and then I went back in 2004, and I didn't know where I was. The change was simply unbelievable. And that's because 2% growth, roughly the US rate of growth, over a century is a 7 times increase. 10% growth, roughly that of China, over a century is not a 100-fold increase, it's not a 1,000-fold increase, it's not a 10,000-fold increase, it's a 14,000-fold increase. Now, my point would be this. After the Cultural Revolution in 1975, China had a level of equality that suppressed creation. It suppressed creativity and effort. And when they dismantled that system, everyone was better off. So there's no question that in China there's much more income inequality, but there's also much higher human welfare.
You've got to have some inequality in order for people to see any benefit from taking effort. That's absolutely a bedrock principle of human behavior. The question always has been how much inequality. If you think about a progressive consumption tax, if I'm talented and I work hard and I produce more than other people in the same arena as I'm in, then I can have the nicest car, I can have the nicest house. As we learned this morning, there'll be more people potentially interested in pairing off with me. So there are all those really big ticket rewards you get from scoring high in relative terms, and none of that would be eliminated by a progressive consumption tax, which would in fact, by increasing savings, fuel exactly the kind of higher growth rate that you would like to see happen.
Okay, I have in here in my pocket an iPhone, and one of the things that I observed is this: when Jobs died, you might have thought that people would say, thank God he's dead. He is one of the, not the 1%, but the 0.0001%. He is one of the very richest people. Thank God he's dead. Nobody said that. Everybody was happy that he had lived and celebrated his life. And that's because the value I get out of this thing, this little thing in my pocket, which I pay quite a bit of money for, is so much higher than the profits that his corporation ever received. In my opinion, if you want creative people to take the risks that are involved in the kind of thing that Jobs did, they have to be able to create to keep a very substantial part of the value of their creation. I don't see people working for nonprofits who take the risk, who go through the anxiety and the pain that startup companies go through, and here I speak from experience.
Thank you very much, please. Thank you. Un aplauso para los dos.